Welcome everyone to Power Hour number 12. And the reason why I'm wearing my sunglasses, because I know as soon as I got on the call, Doug was like, the sunglasses? And I'm like, of course, because I'm pretending right now my background is actually a photograph because I'm really in Sicily. The EU found out that we were having this Power Hour about Southern Italy, and they allowed me to travel to Sicily. So I'm pretending right now that I'm in Sicily. And since I'm in Sicily, we all know the Italians and their sunglasses. So how could I start a power hour without sunglasses, right, Doug? Am I right?
Exactly.
But I'm going to take them off because I cannot see a thing. They're a little too dark. I'm going to put my colorful pink ones on because we know Italians and colors, right? I know Jerry DePergia is on the call, and we were talking about the lemons, the limoncello, right, Doug? So, as you can say, I didn't really formally introduce the Power Hour, but we're going to take a tour of Southern Italy. This is part two of a three-part series with Professor Cantelmo. And thank you, Doug, for joining us once again. Doug is the faculty director of Rome Immersion program at St. John's and also coordinator of the Study Abroad Leadership Council, where right now they're taking time to really improve and create dialogue to improve the abroad experience. And I also want to do a little shout out for some of our viewers here today that are part of our St. John's Globetrotter group. We traveled to Italy about 2 years ago. I can't believe it's 2 years. In October, and Professor Cantelmo came with us along with Miracolo Tours, who planned a fabulous tour of Rome with us. We were there for a week, and we really got to know Doug, and he really knows his stuff about Italy, is really immersed in the history and the culture. So with that ado, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Cantelmo, and we are going to start this wonderful tour of Abruzzo, right?
Yep.
And Sicily.
Exactly.
Campania, you're going to move to our third part, which will be at the beginning of August. So if you enjoy this tour, I hope you'll join us again in August. So let us begin. Ciao. I'm going to turn it off.
Okay. Can you see the screen?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, perfect. So as Susan was saying, this is going to be kind of a multi-part tour of Southern Italy. Originally, this tour was going to include Campania, but then when I was putting together the slides, I realized how much I already had. So I didn't want to kind of breeze through Campania. I'd rather actually linker there. So for this tour, we're going to look at two regions in particular, Abruzzo and then Sicily or Sicilia. So to start out with kind of with Southern Italy in general, the region of Abruzzo is really interesting because it kind of straddles that area between what we would call Central Italy and then also Southern Italy. There's some parts of Abruzzo that are actually kind of within a very short commute of Rome. Sometimes I take my students to places like Tagliacozzo, which is just like an hour and a half train ride from Rome. But then there's other parts of the region that really do feel like you're in Southern Italy. The big thing to talk about when you speak about Abruzzo is how mountainous it is. This is a map of the terrain of Abruzzo. And each of these numbers you see on this map is actually the altitude in meters. The largest mountain outside of the Swiss Alps in Italy is the Corno Grande, which is measured at 2,912 meters. So I'm just going to start kind of just talk about why these mountains are important in terms of Abruzzo's history. So Abruzzo actually has a history that predates Romans in terms of its own civilization and its own cultural groups. This was actually found in a tomb near the Abruzzo border of a Samnite tomb. Now, the Samnites are an interesting group because they're not really talked about the same way the Etruscans are talked about or even the ancient Greek civilization. But the Samnites ruled a place around what is now parts of Campania, Abruzzo, Molise, and really took a large force for the Romans to actually conquer. These wars, called the Samnite Wars, existed for sometimes over several centuries. And the reason why the Samnites were so determined to repel the Romans, but also why the Romans had a hard time repelling the Samnites, is because of these. The mountains of Abruzzo are absolutely ginormous. For most of this region, there's actually these tunneled highways that gets you from one place to the other. The Gran Sasso is kind of the culmination of the highest peaks of these mountains. And the peak of the Gran Sasso is called the Corno Grande. Now, for a little bit of Italian lesson, corno actually means horn, which is actually where we get our word cornetto from. So if you're in Rome, let's say, and you're having a pastry in the morning that looks like a croissant, it's called a cornetto. So grande literally just means the big horn. I'm starting here kind of with a hike to the Corno Grande, which is, again, one of the highest peaks in Europe, which actually I completed myself just last year. Just to give you an idea of how high this peak is, you're in Marche at this point, kind of towards the center of the peninsula, and we're nearing the peak of the Corno Grande, and the blue in the distance that you see is actually the Adriatic Sea. So that's how high up you are when it comes to kind of the view over everything. And when you get to the top of this mountain, it is very much a vertical hike up. The oxygen gets a little thinner, and it is a day hike, but it gets a little bit hard. But at the top, it's a really absolutely wonderful view. So this is me at the very summit of the Corno Grande. And you could really see Abruzzo's hilly region in the distance. And at this point, you're actually above the clouds, which is really cool. Some clouds swept in during this hike, but all the clouds were kind of below us. Now, after a hike like this, or even before, I really wanted to carb load a little bit. And one of my most favorite kind of dishes from this region of Abruzzo is called spaghetti alla chitarra. So chitarra means almost guitar strings. And so this is actually made, as the picture shows, using guitar strings to string out the spaghetti fresh, and then cooked up with almost an Abruzzo version of ragu. Different villages actually have different meats in it. Some villages have some types of lamb and other meats, but it's a really hearty dish because a lot of the people from this region were incredibly hardy farmers, people that had to survive sometimes colder weather. Even though Abruzzo is in southern Italy, especially when you get to higher elevations, it gets a little colder. So oddly enough, in Abruzzo, in some of these areas of the country, a great time to visit might be the summer, because even if it's maybe 90 to 80 degrees in Rome, going to parts of Abruzzo, you could the temperature dip a little bit more. Now, one of the things I would recommend, that I'll leave this slide on, so if you want to, you can write down this name, is to understand Italy is to understand the villages of Italy, but also things that are a little bit off the beaten path. So one of my favorite sites to visit every year after year is called I Borghi più belli d'Italia. So basically that translates into the most beautiful villages of Italy. This was a creation of the Italian Tourist Board because they realized over and over again, when Americans and other foreigners, or even Italians themselves, went to visit the country, they went to visit the same places again and again and again. They sometimes have done this kind of study on Italian towns. They've figured out that around 70% to 80% of the tourists go to the same 20% of the country. So what that means is, even if there's places that are sometimes overrun with tourists, there's other places that are absolutely gorgeous that are not as well trodden. So this is a wonderful website, and they award different towns every year to try to increase tourism to these towns. So especially after coronavirus, after everything subsides, one of the things I'll be doing in my own travels to Italy is really hitting up these towns that definitely need the income, the tourist dollars, but also are absolutely gorgeous in their own right. So one of these towns that has gotten this award recently is called Sulmona. It's a town in Abruzzo that has an absolutely gorgeous view of the surrounding mountainside. But what's really cool about the town is its layers of history. So what's really impressive about kind of Roman engineering is the fact that not only did they have aqueducts systems throughout the Italian peninsula and throughout Europe, but also these aqueduct systems went into places that seemed really inaccessible. So towns like this really have these amazing Roman aqueducts that are from around 2,000 years old, that are still actually in beautiful condition, and they kind of highlight the center of the town. The other reason I bring up this town of Sulmona is that it has one of the best festivals in all of Italy. If you have kids, especially if you're traveling with kids or even yourself who are into history, they have one of the best medieval festivals that I've ever witnessed. It happens in August and in July. And because it's in the mountains, it's not too hot. And it takes place in the middle of their center piazza. And it's actually a jousting match. Now, the jousting doesn't take place where so violently, like, being jousted off of different horses, but it's almost like a figure eight race in which the different horsemen try to take rings off of different kinds of instruments. And the people who complete the race the fastest, as well as complete a certain amount of rings, are declared the winners. And it's a really cool festival. It has parties late into the night, amazing food, and then also really great fun for people of all ages. If you're taking a drive through Abruzzo, and this is one of the things I would just mention with Abruzzo, yes, there are bus connections to different towns. The train system is very sporadic in how it connects different towns. So I would recommend, this is one of those things that the car would definitely be a good option. This is one of my most beautiful places in Abruzzo for me, which is Lago di Scanno. Lago di Scanno is famous because it's a lake that was formed through kind of the glacial melting of the ice off the mountaintops, but also because of its interesting shape. They actually call this the heart-shaped lake because it actually looks like a heart from the side. I don't know if you can see that with this kind of shape. It's kind of beautiful. And then nearby, the town of Scano is also a beautiful place to visit. It's kind of nestled in the Apennine Mountains, and it makes for a really beautiful escape, especially during those warmer months. And then a lot of people in Abruzzo don't really realize, or not in Abruzzo, people who visit Abruzzo don't realize that actually it has a wonderful coastline. So if you're into mountains and seaside, that's great, but also the seaside of Abruzzo is absolutely beautiful as well. So the town of Vasto, which is actually this town that is on a kind of a cliff, almost like a plateau overlooking the seaside, has this beautiful palazzo. If you see on the right of this photo, they actually have this wonderful garden that has these amazing flowers. And they also have the town actually has a beautifully preserved historic center, castle, and a bunch of other amazing things. But then the seaside itself is wonderful as well. The town of Vasto, especially at night, and we're on the Adriatic side, is a beautiful town to explore at night. And again, a lot of these places, you have Italian tourists going there from other regions. You have people maybe from other European countries. But when I'm visiting Abruzzo, I'm not seeing too many Americans, actually. So it's a place that, at least for the American eyes, has been under-touristed as of late. And of course, the seaside of Abruzzo. So what's really interesting is you can have a place with the mountain caps of the Gran Sasso and finish with the fishing villages of Vasto. So these are old, sometimes rickety, wooden plank fishing piers that are stretch out into to the Adriatic. And fishing is a big part of the industry here. So if you're in places like Vasto along the Adriatic, definitely have some seafood. It's absolutely amazing. And then just to talk about just the general region when we talk about southern Italy. Of course, Italy has a history that goes back centuries, even millennia. One thing that I kind of want to touch upon a little bit here is the fact that in Italy, you have different regions, but then also you have different layers of history. So one of the biggest things that I talk to students about when I bring them to Italy is the fact that these different regions have histories that predate ancient Rome. As I said with the Samnites were a tribe that actually predated the Roman Empire and the Roman Republic. In the same way, Greece was actually a big colonizer of southern Italy. So starting in the 8th century BC, so that's about 800, 700 years before the birth of Christ, you have the Greeks of Ionians, the Peloponnese, different parts of mainland Greece, for various reasons, whether they be economic, military, or just people trying to strike out in life, start to colonize parts of the more Western Mediterranean. So this is a map of the places that they founded and places that they settled. So large parts of Puglia, around Campania, Sicily, Calabria. The Greeks even made it as far as Marseille, which actually set up the French wine industry in the 8th century, 7th century BC. So there's been what's really interesting about these connections around the Mediterranean is that there's this trade that exists. So people from Etruscan towns in more northern Italy, we found actually ancient Greek vases that come from Sicily or places in Greece or places like what is today Lebanon. So it's really interesting to see that this part of the Mediterranean, even in 8th century BC, was incredibly interconnected through these settlements. So Sicily, this was when I was talking to Susan about this, a lot of requests were talked about for Sicily. And what I want to talk about with Sicily is something that gets a little bit more off the beaten path. So for this, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the villages of Sicily, the culture and the history. But actually, I'm not going to be talking as much about Palermo and Catania because there's been a lot of talk about the two major cities of Sicily. And I'm going to talk a little bit more of those off the beaten path places. So with Sicily itself, it's important to note that not only is it's an island, but it's an island that has had incredibly tumultuous and complex history. Because it's situated right smack center in the Mediterranean, it's had a history in which it's been conquered by so many different types. I talked about the native Sicilians being colonized by the ancient Greeks. Then the Carthaginians come in from North Africa. Then ancient Romans come in, becoming part of the Roman Empire. After the fall of Rome, you have a series of different rulers and different ages of Greece. You have everything from North African and Arab empires coming in. The Normans, which oddly enough, you're coming all the way from Normandy. These are kind of the legacy of the Vikings coming into Sicily. And you have different kingdoms being ruled. Sicily, until very recently, has never really governed itself in many ways. There's been a lot of different foreign invasions, but because of it, it has an incredibly kind of beautiful, complex culture where you have everything from amazing Greek ruins to Muslim mosques to Norman churches. So it's a really awesome place to really see all these different layers of culture in one place. So for this tour of Sicily, what I'll be doing is kind of doing a clockwise tour around the peninsula. We'll be starting in the northeast, working our way towards the southeast, going along the coast, and then finishing in the west. And along the way, I hope to give you a sense of all these different places. So we'll be starting in the town of Taormina. So I start here because it gives a really good sense of not just that ancient Greek foundation of the city, but also everything that came after it. So Taormina is a beautiful town that has this kind of amazing layers of Gothic architecture, Norman architecture, and then even the gate itself was actually constructed by the Arab empire that moves in during the later Middle Ages. So you have all these different cultures building up this city, but the most famous kind of part of Taormina is its Greek temple, Greek theater, which is an amazing setting, which overlooks the Mediterranean in the background. It should be noted, the reason why I'm using this picture in particular is because I want to note the stands that are set up. A lot of tourists that go through this town, they go on group tours, and they usually spend, maybe up to an hour there walking around, talking about the history. I would recommend for this place, it's actually a working theater. So even though it's a historic site, the town itself actually uses it for performances. Also, Sicily, as many of you who visited know, can get quite hot. So I would recommend actually visiting this amazingly situated ancient theater late in the day. And better yet, visit for a concert. So they have opera, different stage productions, orchestral, and the entire theater is lit up in an absolutely beautiful glow. The great thing about visiting at night for one of these performances is you get to see this theater, but also you get to see this living part of history. I always tell my students that that you are a product of history, but also you are producing your own history. So kind of being in this moment where you can kind of see something that was used basically 2,500 years ago being used currently in its current function as a theater is absolutely amazing. Going south along the eastern coast of Sicily is the town of Siracusa. Now, Siracusa is a really interesting town, Syracuse in English, by the way, which is where we get the New York town name of Syracuse. Uh, so there's two names for this place, which I just want to talk about for a second. This is an aerial shot of Siracusa. It's a town that's on, or a city that's on the Mediterranean, basically facing east. But what's really interesting about the town, it was founded along this almost like little island isthmus or peninsula, in which it's walled off from the Middle Ages. But the name for that town is also called Ortigia. So Ortigia is the name for that historic town as well. The reason why I'm bringing these two names up is there's sometimes where if you're looking up information about visiting Siracusa, both these names sometimes are used interchangeably. So, for example, when you're looking up, there's a beautiful market that you can experience, a food market in Siracusa. They sometimes call it the Ortigia market. So it depends on looking up if you're visiting this town to understand that there's two names of it. The Ortigia is specifically named for this little kind of peninsula sticking out in walled city, which is the historic center or the Centro Storico. But it's a beautiful city to kind of wander around the waterfront, take in the scene. But it's also a wonderful place to get one of the kind of key desserts or sweets of Sicily, which is the granita con brioche. There's different flavors of granita, and granita in a way is kind of like a Italian sorbet. So without any kind of milk product really used. One of the more famous ones of granita, they come in different flavors, is the almond, which I absolutely love. And brioche is the brioche that you know of, except for it's really puffy. And what you can do with the brioche and the granita, and this is also sometimes used as a morning sweet as well with a little cafe, is you can mix the two together and it's absolutely delicious. When I had this the first time, I hadn't had sugar in a while. I was going kind of the sugar-free diet, and it just like absolutely rocked my world when I first had it. So definitely, I would try this if you're in Sicily, especially if it's in a hot place. A great way to cool down. And so when you're walking around this town of Siracusa, there's these beautiful monuments, wide boulevards constructed during the Norman Age and also the Arab Age of Sicily. And then also there's buildings that were built when Italy was unified in the 19th century. And there's these gorgeous fountains that are just absolutely stunning. This one is the statue to Diana, which is the Roman god for the Greek god Artemis. If no one knows what Artemis is, she's the goddess of the hunt. She's also the goddess of kind of the wilderness, of nature, a protector of nature. She's actually one of my favorite ancient Greek gods. Her stories are really interesting and actually really empowering in terms of having a female goddess. But this is a beautiful fountain situated right in the center of the city. And then one of the things I would say when you're in a place like Siracusa is to actually experience the market there. There's markets all over Sicily, but I would definitely recommend checking out markets in places like Siracusa because of the ways in which you see the intermingling of different cultures. So I mentioned before, there's a lot of like North African exchange with a place like this. And so you can really see in the spices being offered, everything from curry to different types of spices, turmerics, different types of things that were found in North Africa. And so the culture and the food of Sicily has this really interesting intertwine of these two different places. And then because these places along the coast have such a deep connection to fishing, there's a really wonderful fish market in this town as well. And even if you're not getting like this right here is men selling this huge group of tuna, chopped up tuna, even if you're not buying a whole fish, it's really cool just to kind of even wandering through these places, strike up conversations, and kind of connect to the culture through food. And then as we make our way from the eastern part of Sicily, we're now in the Valle dei Tempi, or the Valley of the Temples. This name is kind of a misnomer. It's actually not really a valley. It's actually more of sitting on a plateau overlooking valleys. But this is on the near the southern coast of Sicily, and it's one of the best preserved Greek temples anywhere in the world. If you want to see some of the best preserved Greek temples, oddly enough, because of the Greek colonization of Sicily, you actually don't go sometimes to Greece. Greece has some amazing ruins as well. But in terms of preservation, some of the best ones are actually found in Sicily, but also Campania. This temple itself is so well preserved because in the Middle Ages, it was actually converted to a church for a time being until the 18th century. So we see this a lot throughout Italian history. So for example, the Pantheon in Rome, the reason why it looks today the way it looks so well preserved is because it was and is a Roman Catholic church for a long time. So anything that the medieval Christians did not use for ecclesiastical purposes, in a lot of ways, they turned into a quarry. So they would grab stones off of it, marble encasings. So this is a beautifully preserved Greek temple from around the 5th century BC. I also want to note, when you're visiting sites like this, Sicily can get incredibly hot, especially in the summer. And you'll notice that in this photo to the left, there's tourists that are looking at this temple, but you notice that none of them are in the sun. It's actually kind of funny in Italy, you see this during the summer, especially with tourists, that as soon as there's any type of shade, everyone automatically goes towards that shade. So what I would recommend, and a lot of places throughout Italy have these hours, if you're going to Italy during the summer or during the warmer months, to go when the sun starts to set. This is another temple in that Valley of the Tempi. And this one actually was not converted to a church in the Middle Ages, so you can see the state that it's in now. So I would recommend going in the late afternoon. This is that same Valley of the Temples with the town of Agrigento in the background. But better yet, go there at night. What's really cool about places like this is during the summer months, especially June, July, August, even into September, these places open as late as 10 p.m. or even midnight. So you can buy a ticket and go to these places all lit up in the cool of night with a tour guide or by yourself and explore these places at night. I strongly recommend this, especially for older tourists or older visitors, but also even young kids, because I understand, especially in Sicily, when you're standing around a temple learning about history at 95 degrees Fahrenheit, it's not the greatest environment. So it's much better to do that when it's all lit up at night, when it's around 65 degrees or so, or 60 degrees. So the one town I'm going to talk about just now is talk about the interior of Sicily. A lot of the most famous places that people visit within Sicily itself are along the coast. Palermo, Catania, Siracusa. There's all these different beach towns as well that are along the coast. The interior of the country has been for a while more impoverished than other parts. A lot of this has to do with the history of politics in those areas, but also just mere infrastructure. The one thing I would say about Sicily is, yes, in certain parts there are train connections, and yes, there are buses between towns. But this is a place that doesn't have the same level of infrastructure as Northern Italy or even other parts of Southern Italy. So having a car would make the most sense. This place means a lot to me. Palazzo Adriano. It's a town in the center of Sicily that is very emblematic of so many other towns in Sicily. It's a farming community. It has a beautifully preserved historic center. But it's also famous. I'm going to try to see, I haven't talked to Susan about this, but I don't know if Susan can guess what movie was set in this town. I'll show you a series of pictures, Susan, and see if you can get it. This is actually a film shot from that movie. The movie was in 1988, and it won the Oscar that year for Best Foreign Film.
Not Paradiso. Did I get it?
You got it.
Yay, cinema, right?
Yeah,
Cinema Paradiso.
yeah, Cinema
I love
Paradiso.
that movie.
Yeah, so it's really cool. Yeah, so what I would say is to my students is translate your passion wherever you go. So if you're interested in fashion, food, history, sports, whatever it is, some of my students and just people in general are really into films, right? And they're really into movies. So just like how we do in New York, where there's movie tours and stuff like that, what's really cool about Sicily is there's so many towns, and I'm talking beyond The Godfather and those movies, that use the actual towns of Sicily as location shooting for places. So instead of Paradiso, every single one of those shots is actually shot in a real town in Sicily, whether it be a seaside town around along the coast, Palazzo Adriano, where the main movie is set. So what's really cool is if you're interested in visiting Italy, start looking up Italian movies that you really like and see where they're shot. And a lot of times those places are not shot on a set like in Hollywood. They're actually shot in the real place. The person who shot Cinema Paradiso actually grew up in these parts of Sicily, and he used the towns of his childhood to make this movie.
I wonder if there are any towns, because I believe they shot The Godfather on location. Do you know?
Yeah, so
Okay.
that movie was shot in the countryside of west of Sicily in the center of the country, but Corleone is the town, one of the towns that it was shot in because it was Vito Corleone. His name was taken from the town.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, so that town actually has become very popular with tourists because people who are into kind of like mafia history and The Godfather have gone to that town a lot to visit that town. But that's a really cool thing to do. If you're really into music or movie history, finding out where those different things are shot and then visiting those locations, it brings another kind of perspective. And then we're going to end along the coast of Western Sicily now. So there's so many different beautiful seasides in Western Sicily and Northern Sicily as well. I'm going to pick out San Vito Lo Capo because of its beach side, which I know that Susan loves, but also because of its really interesting history and food. The food of Sicily, as I said before, has this really interesting combination of different cultures. So an example of this is from this western part of Sicily is couscous alla trapanese. So there's this town called, or a city called Trapani, which is near this beachhead, which has a lot of Arab influences. And so what's really cool about this town of San Vito Lo Capo is that they actually have a couscous festival every fall. What's really fun about Italy is that a lot of the towns that have these very interesting, unique foods or have things from their history or their from their kind of their family history really celebrate very specific foods. So couscous was imported from North Africa, and with that, the towns around Western Sicily really held on to it. And so they use a lot of couscous in a lot of their dishes. And also they mix it with different spices, but also with different seafoods. So it's a really wonderful way to kind of celebrate not only the culture of Sicily, but also how Sicilian culture was impacted by all these different other cultures. And what other better way kind of to take in the view than along the beaches of Western Sicily? There's parts of Western Sicily that if I didn't tell you where this photo was from, you might have said, does this look like it's almost from the South Pacific or something like that if it wasn't for the Italian flags in the foreground? There's so many amazing places within Sicily to visit. And what's been really interesting to see is Sicilian kind of culture, but also its own tourism really picking up within the last 10 to 20 years. There was a time in the 1980s and 1970s that because of the mafia and because of organized crime, a lot of tourists, but also Americans and other travelers felt very reticent and kind of holding back from actually visiting the island. There's been a lot of changes politically since that time. Of course, organized crime is completely not wiped away, but there's been a large held resistance to this and a really beautiful thing to see of Sicilians kind of taking life back with their own hands. So one thing I would just want to say when you're visiting Sicily is that The Godfather doesn't completely define the island. just like, under the Tuscan sun doesn't define Tuscany. So enjoy every single little corner of this island, as well as with Abruzzo, and understand that everyone has their own experiences. With that, I will open it up to questions, and I will turn it over to anyone who has any questions about anything. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doug. That was wonderful. Definitely escaped. It's a little bit of a tease. I want to get on a plane tomorrow and go to Sicily. It's so beautiful. I've never been. I've been all over Italy, but have not gotten that far down south. But you really bugging me. So as soon as we're able to travel, that's going to be on my list. And I was so excited about the couscous festival. I didn't know about that. I love couscous.
Oh yeah,
Really like it. Yeah.
I didn't show pictures of it, but it's crazy. They have, it's almost like it turns into they have all these different tents set up with all different flavors of couscous, but then they have dancing and music.
That's great.
And yeah, so it's really cool. All these different towns
nice.
have something very specific to what they're known for. And they really kind of draw pride from that. So especially because that town is on the beach, it's absolutely like wonderful because you have the sea breezes. That a lot. The festival happens at night, but in September. Usually it's the second or first week of September,
which is a great time to go to Italy.
Yeah,
right. And September is a beautiful month. I wanted to ask you. I have a question in terms of airports. If you would take this type of trip and follow your itinerary of what you showed us today, where would you fly into? Where would you fly out of? What would you recommend?
So it depends on what airport you're going into. So I would say there's two major hubs for people who are doing international travel. A lot of these flights might be connecting depending on where you're coming from. But Palermo or Catania are the two places that most people fly into. I actually would recommend Catania just because its airport's a little bit easier to use. And Catania as a city is a little bit less chaotic sometimes for the first time visitor than Palermo. They're both big cities, don't get me wrong. But then with flying into Catania, you're already kind of at the foot of Mount Etna. You're right next to Syracuse and those other places I mentioned on the East Coast. But usually it's Palermo or Catania. And then some people, what they like to do with a trip to Italy, it's completely up to the visitor, is do open jaw. So what that means is you're flying in of one place and flying out of another.
Right.
I know sometimes that's more expensive when you buy those tickets,
Yes.
but if you're but if you're saving money in terms of not having to fly back or having to take the rental car back to a longer destination, that could be working. So maybe flying into Catania and out of Syracuse, and but yeah. I would say it's those are the two major airports.
Great. The other thing I noticed is you were showing some of the non-touristy towns, which is wonderful. But if you're going to plan a trip to any of these destinations, and some of these towns are smaller, then where would you stay? Would you go to a main city and then, like you were saying, get a car and then drive to the smaller towns?
Yeah, so I would say breaking up Sicily into like thirds might be useful. So what I mean by that is the island is so big. So to give you an idea, just I was talking about the Trapani before. So Trapani is on the far western side of Sicily. And then if you kind of take a car and drive all the way to Syracuse, that takes you about maybe 5-6 hours, depending.
Oh, wow.
Also understand when you're traveling around Sicily, even if your GPS says that it's going to take you, let's say, an hour, some of the interior roads are not as well maintained sometimes as ones in northern Italy. They've done a lot better job, and actually the EU has infused a lot of money in terms of the construction of major arteries. To your question, I would say I'm going to follow the advice that I gave last time. I would say start in the larger cities. So Syracuse is a fairly large city. And also you can take side trips from that to other places, and then finish on the beach. So I would say, situate yourself in a larger city first, getting accustomed, maybe also a big thing, I didn't mention this, but people who like opera, especially in places like Palermo, the Palermo Opera House is huge and it's absolutely gorgeous. They did an amazing renovation on that. And so starting in the city and then maybe checking out an agriturismo. especially in the center of the country. One of those like little farms to stay on, and then ending on the beach. That would be my itinerary.
Oh, great. Well, it's funny. You brought back lots of memories of my trip 2 years ago with the Globetrotters, because I took a week after that. And one of the McAllens, Marilyn and myself, we drove through Abruzzo and then ended up in the Marche region. And I remember going through those tunnels where you were showing when you first started your presentation. And let me tell you, I felt like Mario Andretti. Those roads are, I mean, like you said, they've really improved since I was a little girl when I went to Italy. So it is better getting around, but you have to be prepared to drive with two hands on the wheel, because the Italians are only an inch away from you if you don't go fast enough. And it was raining too, and there was lots of construction. And unfortunately, it's not like America where we have 50 million signs warning you about the construction coming up. It literally came up, and I had to quick make a decision, go in the next lane. It was quite an experience, I will say. So you might want to hire a driver on some of those roads, I would say, if you're not confident driving, internationally. Because I have to say it was challenging at times. It really was. It was exciting. And then on the other side, it was like, oh, gee, because you're going from bright light, to dark tunnel. And the tunnels are pretty long,
It is. But also I was mentioning, I talk about hiking, and I know a lot of the people on this call might not want to hike up an entire 2,000-foot mountain.
That looked challenging too.
That looked challenging. Yeah. So, but what we can do is there are bus tours. And what's really cool about even if you don't do like a tour bus with a group, even just they do have certain buses that are kind of like a fancier version of Greyhound or Megabus and things like that. Because they have those huge windows, you can really take in the view. It's really a nice way to do it. And also your hands are not on the wheel then either.
I'm just checking to see if we have any more questions. You said there's a question. I'm not seeing. Does anyone have any questions? I'm looking, and then it's not coming up. Do you see any on your end?
Yeah, I do.
Mine doesn't work.
I do. I can read them
I'm
off.
sorry, there is a question.
Yeah.
I see, given that many of the places you featured are not touristy, can you get by if you don't speak Italian? Good question.
Also, I would just make a mention to that. Sometimes Italians have a hard time with the Sicilian dialect.
Exactly, yes.
So because of that, sometimes people are all in the same boat. It depends on where you're talking. I would say most of the major cities, especially when I talked about Taormina, Siracusa, the western part around Trapani, the beach towns, you're going to see a lot of people speaking English. Not that they're American, but that they actually speak English pretty well. I would say the one thing that you might have a little bit of trouble if you start going to the interior of the country with those smaller villages, that might be some difficulty. But I always recommend to my students, just if you speak slowly, have a smile on your face. I would say, Sicily has a lot of just absolutely friendly people because they too understand the history of their own island, and the people who I've met are so ready to put a different face than the ones that Americans have seen in the movies. So, especially just like the people who I've met, it's been a joy to see kind of this island grow and expand and things like that. But yeah, I would say as long as a lot of the larger cities or towns, or I would say if some villages in the interior, yeah, you might have some problems. But Google Translate, I would just say, is an amazing tool.
Yes.
And also Google Translate now works offline, so you can download Italian offline. So what that means is even if you have no internet connection, even if you have your phone on airplane mode, you can still translate into English. And what's really cool about the Google Translate app now is that it has a photography feature where you can, let's say you have a menu and it's completely in Italian and you have no idea what's on it. You can actually put the phone over the menu and it actually picks up based on like kind of the algorithm they have and translates it for you. So there's a lot of different tools out there now, which is wonderful.
No, that's true. That's very true. I will say though, some of my friends who are Sicilian and visited Sicily recently, they tried to speak the dialect, and a lot of the young people now are speaking, you know, I guess when you want to say classic Italian, or they say high Italian or something like that. So it's interesting. They're moving away from their dialect. Hopefully they're not moving away from their history. We have another question. What is the name of the bridge going from Italy to the island of Sicily, or do you go through a tunnel?
Yeah. So what you do with that transportation is there's actually not a bridge per se, and from my understanding, it actually there's actually a connection via ferry. What she's talking about is kind of the connection between Messina and then the place of island of Calabria. I'm trying to remember the actual. Give me one second. Tunnel. Yeah, it's I'm trying to remember the name of the place. Yeah, so they have a suspension bridge now constructed. But it's something that's very new. For a long time, there's actually only ferries going across. So this kind of long-term, sorry, let me clarify. The suspension bridge is kind of in the works. So it's not a current bridge. So currently, it's actually ferries that cross across. And it's something that's a long-term plan to connect the island to the rest of Calabria. And it's not currently connected in that way.
Interesting.
Yeah.
This is not related to the talk, but I see in the chat, Richard was asking about what you teach and what you actually do at St. John's. And I know you wanted to elaborate a little bit about the Abroad Leadership Committee. It must be a little frustrating right now because obviously EU is not allowing us to travel to Europe, although there are some places to travel. But what is really going on with the study abroad program now?
So currently we're not sending students abroad for the fall semester for many different reasons, but chief among them is, COVID and the continuing epidemic. And again, for St. John's University, they want to have the health of their students foremost. We don't want to be sending students away during this time. And so during this time, I think it's really important to kind of use this time as a university to rethink what we're doing. And a lot of departments are doing this on all fronts. And so when I was mentioning before about the Study Abroad Leadership Council, for a long time, St. John's University has had this program called Global Ambassadors, which are students that really share the word of study abroad with other students on campus. So they plan events and things like that. It's been a great resource. What I'm putting together right now is something that goes deeper a little bit in terms of what students want and what students are thinking. So when I talk about the Study Abroad Leadership Council, what that will be is a group of students that are thinking through ways to improve St. John's study abroad experiences. Everything from mental health abroad, financial support, different ways in which we can engage different populations that have not normally studied abroad. Oddly enough, the vast majority of study abroad students, not just at St. John's, but universities across the country, are women. Men don't study abroad at the same rates as women. So
That's interesting.
Yeah, sometimes some universities have it like as high as 80% are women
Really?
that study abroad. Yeah.
Wow.
And there's also, if you want to Google this, there's a lot of research papers that are written of why don't guys study abroad. But there's
girl power. I love that. Yeah.
No, so we definitely want to continue encourage women to study abroad.
Love it.
But
Adventurous.
Exactly. Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
But just to really make sure the resources are available to students who want to study abroad from all different backgrounds and have a conversation of how we can improve different things. So, yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I don't see that we have any more questions.
I see one.
Do you see one more? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I don't see it.
So there's a question from Michael who's asking about the Albanian influence in southeastern Italy.
Oh, sorry, Michael. I didn't see your question. Sorry about that.
Yeah, so I think he's referencing the region of Puglia. So this is actually a place that we actually take some of our St. John's students this past year. So Puglia is the heel of the Italian peninsula. We'll be talking about it in an upcoming talk, and I'll definitely talk about Albanian influences in that region. But specifically because Puglia is so close to Albania, there has been a lot of really interesting infusion of cultures from Albania to Puglia. So specifically, when we have our students visit the town of Otranto, which is in far southeastern Italy, there's actually a memorial for Albanians who actually died at sea, sometimes crossing between Albania and Puglia. But really interesting, especially when you go into far southeastern Italy. It resembles sometimes more Greek and Albanian than sometimes Italian, especially when it comes to the dialect in terms of its own history. Sometimes the photos I take of things that are existing in Puglia, some of the buildings, the styles of the architecture look very much like it could be coming from Corfu or from the Albanian coast. So that's a good question.
Richard was asking if you've ever been to Mount Etna when it erupted or after it erupted.
I have actually. That's the one place I want to put on my list. I love hiking. I love nature. I've not been to Mount Etna yet. I want to at some point in the future. I think that especially during this time of COVID, tourism has really embraced nature in many ways because people can't visit cities and large towns. So I just have actually even seen my own Italian friends who are over in Italy doing a lot of like nature trips and things like that within the country. So Mount Etna, that volcano, as long as it's pretty quiet, I'm excited. I would be excited to visit and hike.
That's great. And Richard is also asking about Croatia, doing any Croatian tours. Is that something you might want to do? We could do in the new year because we have a schedule awaiting to be coordinated.
So I've actually never been to Croatia. So I really want to. It's a beautiful country. My wife actually went on a girls' trip to Croatia and did not have me tag along on that.
And we'll have her do the tour for us.
Maybe she'll do the tour. Yeah, so
she can.
Yeah, but Croatia is really interesting, especially that whole Adriatic coast. Everything from Croatia to Montenegro, Slovenia, northeastern Italy. Yeah, and so that'd be a really cool trip.
I have to say though, my sister went on a cruise and Mediterranean cruise, and she went to Croatia and Sicily. And she was amazed. She loved Sicily far more, and I'm sorry if anyone's Croatian on this call, far more than Croatia. I think sometimes Croatia, might get more fanfare. But again, it could be because of the Game of Thrones. She said everybody was going to Croatia because of the Game of Thrones. Yeah. So a lot of, like you said, a lot of shows like Downton Abbey, everybody's flocking, to England. A lot of these shows lately on these Netflix or Prime are really getting people to travel to certain destinations now.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah,
I've noticed that, but also it's been interesting with Croatia, and actually Greece has had this issue as well, is how do you control crowds? So especially when it comes to Croatia, a big part of their income and tourism revenue is coming from cruise ships, which do give a lot to the economy in terms of people spending things during the day. But some people have mentioned that it's not as sustainable. And sometimes it can completely overwhelm. It's one thing having a cruise ship dock and then go to a large city. It's another thing when they go to these very small fishing villages. So places like Croatia and even in Greece, I heard a story recently of how Santorini is really now rethinking this how they advertise themselves or how they
really
because they think of coronavirus as maybe a reset of that they need tourism dollars, but maybe we can do things in a more sustainable way that our island is not completely overrun.
No.
So,
and that's probably why my sister didn't really like Croatia as much as Sicily, because of this Game of Thrones. She couldn't get over. Many people were going there because of this show. And we saw also in Venice. I mean, Venice was taken over by the virus because of all the cruise ships that go in there that are probably, hurting the city with pollution and all of that. So, we always say, something bad, but something good comes out of it. People start to reevaluate and say, is this really important? Because like you said, you're really starting to take away from some of these places. There is a question here that I want to answer. Yes, this Power Hour, all our Power Hours are recorded and they're put on the Gift Planning YouTube channel, which we have. So you could see all 12 of them again, if you'd like, or if you haven't seen any of them. I know some people couldn't participate. We always try different times of the day, and it works for some people and not for everyone. But the good part is you can see the recording and you can watch it. And because you gave us so many details, you probably have to and to write everything down, especially I know someone that I work with, one of my colleagues, she said, oh, in another week I was going to Sicily. I was like, oh, you have to come on the call then. It'll make you feel a little better, hopefully, you know. I really feel badly if anyone out there, anybody who's viewing today's show, I'm sorry if you had any trips planned. It's really, you know, it's hard. You know, people try to understand, but still, you know, it's something that some people plan a year in advance, and you do all this planning and time and effort. Somebody was having a family reunion trip, I know. That's something you really, really look for. And it is sad that some of you know, some of the people can't, you know, go on these trips, but there's always a next year. Let's pray, you know, we'll see what happens. But if anybody's on the call that's a Globetrotter, we're going to stay on for a little while and have a little reunion and see what all of you are doing. If anybody else wants to stay on, you can meet our Globetrotters. You can ask them questions about our trips. I mean, talk about timing. We just finally got this travel program going, and it's a shame. We were supposed to go to France in October, but we postponed it to 2021. So you still have time to become a Globetrotter if you want and join us for our Paris trip, where we celebrate the school's 150th anniversary. Can you believe it? So that'll be really fun. So we have more time to plan and do fun things on this trip. But again, thank you, Doug, so much. Really appreciate it. Richard is sending his thanks. Justine is sending her thanks. I'm glad everyone enjoyed it. Again, we will see you again, I think August 4th, is it? Was the next one?
Definitely. Yeah.
We do Southern Italy. If you want, next week at 1 o'clock, July 14th, we're going to have some life insurance experts that are going to tell us how we need to review and look at life insurance policies during the pandemic. So I'm sure they'll have some good information for us there. So we hope you join us next Tuesday. But until then, maybe you should go to the liquor store or something. I can't believe I'm saying this, probably gonna get fired. And buy some limoncello because it was delicious. Thank you, Jerry, for reminding me. And because we know lemons are so wonderful and bountiful in Southern Italy. But thank you again for joining us. It's great to stay connected with our donors. We appreciate all your support. And like I say at the end of every Power Hour, Alma Mater needs your support. To come onto this call is showing your support, and we really appreciate it. We have an emergency student fund. Our students do need support. I'm sure you're reading in the papers, you know, struggling with meeting the cost of tuition and everything. They have all this equipment, because I know I'm going broke with all this equipment that I need for at home to work online. So please stay with us and please support St. John's, and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you. Thanks again. But stay on the call if anybody wants to stay on.